Consider for a moment the publication of the book Emile back in 1762. It was a treatise so moving that it fundamentally changed how the world thought about raising children. The author argued with this incredible passion that education shouldn't be about rigid discipline. It should be about preserving a child's natural innocence. He wrote about the sacred duty of parenting and the deep corruption of society. And when you read it, you get this sense of a man with a boundless, almost saintly capacity for love and for nurturing. But then if you look away from the page and you peer into the author's actual life, well, the image just shatters completely. This same man, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, living in a hotel with a chambermaid, fathered 5 children, and 5 times, as soon as they were born, he didn't apply a single one of his benevolent theories. Instead, he forced their mother to give them up. He sent every single one to a foundling hospital. And these were institutions which, at the time, were essentially death sentences. This jarring disconnect, it defines Rousseau. How does a man become the greatest champion of natural goodness and human freedom while, seemingly lacking the most basic natural instinct of a father? It forces us to ask, was his philosophy a genuine roadmap for humanity, or was it a desperate intellectual attempt to atone for the sins of a life lived in total contradiction?
Rousseau, who lived from 1712 to 1778, is absolutely one of those monumental figures where the contradictions are.
Yeah.
Well, they're central to understanding his philosophy.
He wasn't just a philosopher, though.
Not at all. He was a Genevan thinker, a celebrated composer, a novelist. Truly one of the pivotal intellectual forces behind both the French Revolution and subsequent political movements. He influenced everyone from Kant to Marx.
And his critique of civilization, of how society corrupts the individual, that really set the stage for the whole Romantic movement, right? This focus on nature and authenticity.
It absolutely did. And that tension you mentioned, it's the very engine of his thought.
The tension between his life and his work.
Exactly. His central driving concern, and this is really the core of our deep dive today, is figuring out how to construct a meaningful, fulfilling human life without falling into the trap of social dependence.
He saw that as the fundamental problem.
He did. He realized that as people live closer together, they become overwhelmingly reliant on the opinions and validation of others. And for him, this state of social dependency was just fundamentally destructive. It destroys individual freedom and what he would call psychological authenticity.
So his entire life's work is an attempt to fix that.
It's an attempt to prescribe 2 paths to freedom. One is political, defining a legitimate government through the social contract, and the other is educational, designing a system to nurture a child's autonomy and prevent that destructive self-interest from ever taking root.
Okay, so that frames our mission. We need to figure out if Rousseau's framework, despite his own, let's say, profound personal failures, can offer us a genuine path forward. Let's start at the source of the rot he identified, his moral psychology. We have to unpack this crucial distinction he makes between 2 very different kinds of self-love.
To understand Rousseau, you first have to understand his idea of the state of nature, because it really serves as his yardstick for measuring modern moral decline.
And this is where he completely breaks from his predecessors, especially someone like Thomas Hobbes.
A total break. Hobbes argued that without governance, humanity lives in this constant, brutal war of all against all. For him, humans are just inherently selfish, power-seeking creatures. So the state of nature is a state of, immorality.
And John Locke's view was a bit milder, but still social, wasn't it?
Locke's was milder, yeah. He thought humans had natural rights and reason even before government. For Locke, the social contract was mostly just to, adjudicate disputes and protect private property. His pre-social man was essentially rational, just lacking political institutions.
But Rousseau just demolishes both of those views.
He really does. For Rousseau, the state of nature was a pre-social, pre-reflective condition. The original man, this natural man, was a solitary creature, guided purely by instinct.
And crucially, it was a state of innocence.
A state of innocence, that's the key phrase. It's a condition that exists, as he put it, beyond the distinction between good and evil. Natural man didn't have complex language or moral reflection or abstract thought.
So he wasn't yet a moral agent.
Not at all. He was, in Rousseau's words, potentially man. His existence was simple, solitary, and fundamentally sufficient. And it was all governed by 2 basic, non-corrupting instincts.
Okay, so these 2 instincts are the foundation for everything that comes after.
They are the absolute core of his benign view of natural psychology. The first is amour de soi,
which literally translates to self-love.
Right. And this is the primordial instinctual drive towards self-preservation. seeking food, shelter, basic physical needs. This drive is healthy, it's non-corrupting, because it's focused entirely on internal sufficiency.
It doesn't require anyone else.
It doesn't require others, so it generates no conflict. It's just about meeting your own biological needs.
And the second instinct, that's what acts as a natural brake, right? That's what prevents that Hobbesian war of all against all.
That's pitié, compassion or sympathy. It's an innate, almost visceral aversion to seeing another sentient being suffer.
So it's not a rational choice, it's a gut reaction.
A total gut reaction. It's a natural impulse to relieve the suffering of others, and that includes animals, as long as it doesn't threaten your own immediate survival, your own amour de soi. So in this pre-social state, pitié is the main moral guide. It's a powerful, instinctual restraint on selfishness.
If you see something in pain, you just instinctively recoil.
Exactly. It's immediate, it's passive, and it requires zero abstract reasoning.
Okay, so if natural man was inherently innocent, self-sufficient, and instinctively empathetic, what on earth happened? What was the mechanism of the fall? What broke that equilibrium and brought about what he called the chains of civilization?
The fall was, for Rousseau, an accident. It was a consequence of our potential, not some kind of original sin. And the catastrophe was driven by two unique human characteristics that separated us from mere animals.
Which were?
Freedom, which is the capacity to choose and to act against your instinct. And the second one, perfectibility.
Perfectibility, that sounds like a good thing.
It sounds great, but it's the real game changer here. It's the infinite capacity to learn, to adapt, and to improve one's means of satisfying needs. It is, for Rousseau, the engine of all human history.
Wow, that is a profound diagnosis. So the very thing we celebrate as progress, our capacity to improve, to innovate, to develop, that's what ultimately ruined us.
Precisely. Perfectibility led to innovation, things like tools, agriculture, that forced interdependence, division of labor. And then critically, it led to comparison.
Comparison.
Yeah. Rousseau suggests the fatal shift began when these isolated individuals started gathering together, maybe to hunt or maybe for leisure, for social bonding, like singing and dancing around a fire.
And once they're all assembled,
they inevitably began comparing themselves, comparing strength, talent, utility. And that moment of comparison introduced a consciousness of social rank, which leads directly to jealousy, pride, and vanity.
So comparison is the origin of inequality.
Yeah.
And it's the source of that dark, corrosive form of self-love.
That is the birth of Amour Propre, the socialized self-love. It's often translated as pride, but it really carries the connotation of vanity.
And how is that different from the healthy amour de soi?
Unlike amour de soi, which just seeks physical fulfillment and internal sufficiency, amour propre is driven by the need to be esteemed, to be valued, to be recognized by others. And crucially, this need often escalates into seeking esteem as being superior to others.
This is a devastating shift because it means my self-worth is no longer self-sufficient. I am now completely dependent on external judgment, and therefore I'm fundamentally unfree.
You've just hit on the absolute core of Rousseauvian psychological alienation. This new social structure forces people into roles. The subordinate needs the superior for material survival.
But the superior also needs the subordinate.
The superior needs the subordinate for the recognition and the flattery that fuels their amour propre. It creates a world of dissimulation. People have to constantly misrepresent their true beliefs and desires just to gain social approval or material ends.
Which leads to this profound self-estrangement and ultimately oppression.
Yes. There's that famous anecdote he uses in the discourse on inequality about the European minister.
Right. He paints this picture of a man who has to debase himself, flattering everyone he meets just to keep his position. He realizes his entire existence is just a performance for other people.
It's utterly tragic. He's materially wealthy, but he's psychologically enslaved. His true self is completely irrelevant. Only his public image matters.
And this critique wasn't just about moral behavior. He famously went after the very foundation of the Enlightenment itself in his first discourse. He argued that intellectual development was actually corrupting public virtue.
He did. And it resonates so powerfully with some of the contemporary anxieties you see today about things like the collapse of meritocracy or the dissolution of social bonds.
It's true. The critique we often hear now, especially around certain aspects of meritocracy, is that intellectual brilliance has become somehow divorced from common sense or civic virtue. And Rousseau was making that exact argument almost 3 centuries ago. How did he connect the pursuit of arts and sciences to moral decline?
Well, he argued that the advancement of intellectual life, the arts, the sciences, It's not motivated by a pure love of truth or civic duty. It's motivated by the urge for distinction.
To stand out, to be praised, to be seen as superior.
It's pure amour propre driving the whole intellectual effort. So when a society starts to reward and celebrate intellectual refinement above all else, it focuses attention away from practical civic virtue and directs it towards superficial intellectual performance.
So the pursuit of scholarly fame becomes this acidic solvent that just dissolves the basic organic ties of a community.
Precisely. Rousseau feared that this focus on intellectual refinement creates a kind of societal sickness. People learn to speak beautifully about justice without knowing how to be just. It's a skepticism that directly challenges that Enlightenment notion of inevitable societal progress through acquiring knowledge.
It really touches on that modern anxiety that if we only value abstract knowledge, we undermine the foundational virtues you need for a functioning community.
There's a perfect illustration of this, a story set in a Genevan cafe around 1750 that just captures the spirit of Rousseau's critique.
Tell us about it.
It involves a young, aspiring writer named Eloise. She was thrilled about a new literary academy that was dedicated to, quote, polishing the national character. But an older philosopher who was clearly reflecting Rousseau's emerging influence, he challenged her priorities.
And what was the essence of his warning to her?
He was incredibly blunt. He asked her, "The academy teaches you to speak brilliantly about justice, yes, but does it teach you to act justly? You've learned to write beautifully about poverty, but have you learned to share your own bread with a starving man, or even just to acknowledge his presence?"
Wow. So the lesson is that intellectual abstraction, the eloquent discussion of virtue, can become a kind of escape from the hard work of actually embodying that virtue.
Yes. The ability to analyze morality becomes a substitute for possessing morality.
And that allows for some pretty profound moral self-deception.
It does. Rousseau famously critiqued theater audiences for this. He said they would weep for a tragic character on stage, feeling deeply compassionate, and they'd take that emotional experience as proof of their own natural goodness, their pitié.
So they leave the theater convinced they're good people.
Convinced. And this psychological self-justification then frees them to act viciously outside the theater, to be indifferent to real-world suffering, to exploit their workers, or in his case, to abandon their own children. Their feeling of compassion becomes this convenient moral shield, which just reinforces the alienation and oppression he saw everywhere.
And this is where Rousseau's analysis feels, well, just terrifyingly relevant today. If amour propre is this desire for external validation and distinction, he basically described the entire architecture of the modern digital age centuries before it ever existed.
His framework is an absolute roadmap for diagnosing the modern attention economy, the entire structure of social media where your self-identity is transformed into a performative, quantifiable metric dependent on likes and views and followers. It's the ultimate cultivation of what he would call inflamed amour propre.
It's an environment engineered for distinction and comparison.
Totally. We've basically taken the psychological fracture Rousseau described and scaled it globally. We've traded authentic self-sufficiency, that amour de soi, for a distorted public version of self-love that can never, ever be satisfied.
And this distortion has a name now, doesn't it?
It does. Scholars call it prophilicity. It's the conscious, continuous creation of an idealized, curated online avatarism. We spend incredible amounts of psychological energy molding this online identity through selective curation, filtering, and constantly evaluating feedback.
The danger being that the image, the profile, starts to replace the original integrated self.
That's the acute danger. Reputation, which is defined by these external metrics, starts to outweigh genuine integrity. And this constant need for validation, it compels conformity to whatever the digital crowd happens to be celebrating at that particular moment.
So the algorithms don't just show us what we want to see. They actively force us to become what he called homo comparativist man, the comparator, in this permanent competitive state of self-evaluation.
Exactly. Yeah. Rousseau noted that once amour propre takes hold, the relative I dominates. The individual never observes others without returning to himself and comparing himself with them. Social media is just that process formalized and, you could say, weaponized.
The algorithms are constantly presenting these idealized versions of other people's lives.
Right, which just amplifies the sense of inadequacy. Yeah. Success metrics get reduced to these thin, quantifiable metrics, follower counts, engagement rates. It drives vanity and narcissism to what we could easily call a point of climax, because there's just no natural ceiling to the desire for distinction. You can always have more.
And the whole system is designed to create dependency. If my self-worth is tied to this constant flow of social capital, I become hyper-fixated on managing my online self. It sounds like a form of digital enslavement.
It is the enslavement of the dependent will. That need for external validation breeds perfectionism and a paralyzing fear of negative evaluation.
Yeah.
And this forces what's called adaptive social media use, meaning the user modifies their behavior, their opinions, their entire presentation based entirely on the feedback loops they receive, not on their own internal values. And that loss of autonomy is the very condition of unfreedom that Rousseau warned us about.
And what are the measurable psychological costs of this relentless performance culture? Beyond the obvious anxiety, what does this chronic state of comparison do to the self?
The clinical data is, well, it's undeniable at this point. We see a very strong correlation between excessive social media engagement and negative psychological outcomes. Things like acute anxiety, significant sleep disruption, body image issues.
But there's something more insidious, too.
Yes. Perhaps more insidious is the pervasive chronic mild depression, this lingering sense of emotional exhaustion or flatness that has been termed digital stress or dysthymia.
So it's not acute sadness, it's just a persistent feeling that you're never quite enough.
Exactly. Or that your life is slightly disappointing compared to the curated feeds you're seeing all day.
And the oversharing aspect, the compulsion to constantly report on your own existence, that just reinforces the anxiety.
It creates a feedback loop. Findings suggest that the greater the degree of oversharing, this persistent public articulation of one's private life, the higher the correlation with generalized anxiety. The self is fractured. It's relying entirely on the approval of strangers for affirmation.
And this environment just reinforces social inequalities, demanding a level of perfection that's impossible to meet in reality.
Which leads inexorably back to self-alienation.
Okay, so we've diagnosed the modern self as being fractured by this inflamed amour propre. The critical philosophical question that follows from that is whether this destructive self-love is just an unavoidable evil of society or if it can be redirected toward virtue. How do you possibly salvage it in this glass house society of constant surveillance?
The Rousseauvian solution, which was adapted by later philosophers, insists on redirection, not elimination. You can't get rid of it. Since amour propre is an inevitable consequence of human society, we have to aim it toward values that serve both the individual and the common good, rather than destructive ends like popularity or just, empty distinction.
It's an issue of value capture, making the desire for recognition attached to worthy objects.
That's a great way to put it. You shift the focus from mere appearance to tangible reality.
Explain that distinction.
Well, a self-love that pursues esteem based on values rooted in reality is considered true pride. This is the recognition you get for achieving something genuinely valuable, like acquiring a skill, gaining wisdom, or contributing positively to your community. This redirection transforms a social impulse into something constructive.
As opposed to vanity.
Which is completely different. Vanity seeks recognition based solely on arbitrary opinion, external display, or status symbols. So for Rousseau, pride is only virtuous when it serves a higher purpose. If your self-worth depends on achieving something whose merit is rooted in reality, it's pride. If it depends on the arbitrary opinion of others, it's vanity.
But a literal return to the isolated provincial life that Rousseau sometimes idealized is impossible. We're all inescapably connected now by smartphones and digital platforms. So how does one apply this redirection practically in the 21st century?
The most practical modern application is often called digital minimalism. It represents an attempt to construct an intentional, conscious, and limited relationship with digital technology.
So it's a strategic choice to withdraw from those constant feedback loops and the comparison culture.
Exactly. This approach grounds your online presence, your profile, in amour de soi and in virtue, rather than letting it be controlled by the whims of amour propre.
So that means replacing passive consumption and performance anxiety with active, focused use. It's about seeking proper rank real value, not just empty likes.
It is about reclaiming your autonomy. The digital minimalist modifies their behavior based on internal intention, what I value, not on external feedback loops. This respects others, it limits the exposure to comparison, and it attempts to ground the social self in authentic self-love, governed by that higher rational faculty, conscience.
It's the practical realization that if we can't return to nature, we have to impose the principles of nature sufficiency, self-determination, intentionality onto our technology.
A difficult task, but that's the path. And for Rousseau, that internal work had to be matched by external structures. He saw two simultaneous paths as necessary to forge a free citizen who could thrive in society without being corrupted.
A comprehensive, non-corrupting education and a legitimate political contract based on the common interest.
Yes, both are designed to achieve what we could call renaturalization, to bring the goodness of the natural man into the complexities of the social world.
Let's start with education. He saw that as absolutely foundational for preparing the individual for citizenship.
In his book, Emile, Rousseau outlines his vision for a radical negative education. The central principle is that education should not be about rigid discipline or just, filling a child's mind with abstract, corrupting social knowledge before they're ready to reason.
The focus is on shielding the student from those premature social pressures.
And letting nature be the teacher. It's an incredibly child-centered approach, really focused on the innate goodness he believed existed in every child.
So how does it work in practice?
The method relies heavily on experiential learning and very careful environmental manipulation. The tutor's role isn't to lecture, but to guide the student, Emile, so that he discovers lessons autonomously through the natural, inevitable consequences of his own actions.
He also emphasized practical skills, right?
Immensely. He advocated for rigorous exercise of bodily powers and insisted that every child must learn a practical trade, not just for its utility, but because working with your hands grounds the mind in reality and teaches a respect for labor.
And the ultimate psychological goal of this whole process is to cultivate conscience. How does that differ from the instinctive pitié we talked about earlier?
This is a crucial distinction that often gets missed. Pitié is passive, it's instinctual, it's non-rational, it's just recoiling from suffering. Conscience is active, it's rational, and it's developed. It is the faculty that leads to the love of justice, morality, and social order.
So education transforms that passive sympathy into active, rational judgment about right and wrong.
It does. Conscience shapes amour propre by directing the desire for recognition toward moral actions, turning a potentially selfish impulse into loving social passions. And this fully formed conscience is what enables the citizen to serve the social contract naturally, without coercion.
This whole philosophy really shines through in that powerful anecdote about the village school near the French Alps, the one overseen by Monsieur Pierre.
Yes, it perfectly captures the essence of his pedagogical approach and its relevance to anxieties about the erosion of social responsibility. Monsieur Pierre refused to teach abstract subjects like catechism or classical rhetoric before the age of 12.
Instead, the students mastered practical, reality-rooted skills.
Things like gardening, carpentry, understanding soil quality, and the absolute necessity of communal effort.
So he taught social responsibility by focusing on organic, inevitable consequences rather than abstract rules or external punishments.
Exactly. The school operated as a microcosm of his ideal republic, where interdependence was immediate and visible. If a student, let's say, young Colette, neglected her duty to water her section of the communal garden, the entire community experienced the shared loss of the withered crop.
So it taught social responsibility through immediate felt accountability. It fosters a sense of duty that's rooted in concrete consequences.
Right. The lesson wasn't don't break the rule. It was failing to contribute harms the group. The goal was to forge an individual whose conscience and character would serve the common good naturally.
And there's that famous exchange when a sophisticated Parisian nobleman visits and criticizes Pierre's students for not being able to debate Virgil or cite abstract political theories.
And Pierre's reply is just perfect. He says simply that he was forging an individual who understood the difference between a broken fence and a broken promise. An individual grounded in practical moral reality, which is the perfect antidote to the erosion of social responsibility he saw in the abstracted, jaded elites of his time.
So this educated, conscientious individual is now ready for this social contract. What, then, is Rousseau's definitive vision of the common good that they are expected to uphold?
The common good is intrinsically good, but it's not a natural state. It's a social creation. It's rooted in human convention and social order, and it's achieved when individuals recognize that the best way to protect themselves, to satisfy their fundamental amour de soi, is to protect the environment and the community around them.
It's that classical conception of the common good, something that allows the entire community and all life within it to attain well-being and to flourish.
Precisely. But this requires a massive shift. It means abandoning the license to just follow your own sheer appetites.
This necessitates the contractual exchange.
Yes. Every citizen has to give up their natural liberty and their unlimited rights, the license to pursue individual caprice, in exchange for civil liberty and proprietary ownership, which are now guided by reason and duty.
It's a great paradox.
It is. The passions of Amour Propre lead to the slavery of social dependence. But obedience to the law, which the community collectively prescribes to itself, that is true liberty. The social contract protects us from the domination of others and ensures the persistence of our own self-preservation.
And the mechanism that expresses this common interest, this collective freedom, is the general will. We need to be very clear about what that is, and maybe more importantly, what it is not.
Okay, so the general will is the collective will of the people that expresses the common good. It is always directed toward the community's overall best interest. It requires active citizenship, deliberation, and direct input.
And you have to distinguish it from the will of all.
Critically, the will of all is simply the sum of private, selfish interests. It's the aggregate of what every individual wants for themselves. The general will, by contrast, is what the community needs to flourish.
So if everyone votes for a tax break that only benefits their own private business, that's the will of all.
Right. But if they vote for universal sanitation or public education that benefits the entire city, even if it costs them personally, that's the general will.
The general will focuses on general laws applicable to all citizens, ensuring the common interest prevails over private interests.
And it is the source of all legitimate law. By obeying this law, the citizen is subject only to his or her own collective will, and thereby achieves a rational freedom. For Rousseau, this was the ultimate test of a legitimate state.
But he was also radically uncompromising about how the general will must be expressed and protected.
Extremely. He believed that sovereignty, the legislative power, cannot be delegated, represented, or alienated. He explicitly rejected the entire concept of representation.
That's an overwhelming critique of virtually every modern democracy, including the United States, where representation is the whole political model.
He was deeply distrustful of delegated authority. For him, the deputies chosen by the people are merely agents. They can propose laws, but any law that is not ratified by the populace in person is null and void.
And he believed the widespread desire to be represented is a symptom of moral decline.
It is. It signifies that citizens value their convenience over their civic duties. And beyond that, he was profoundly pessimistic about governance itself. He predicted an inevitable conflict between the sovereign, that is, the people expressing the general will, and the government, the magistrates who form the executive branch.
He predicted that the government would always try to seize power.
Always. The government, being a smaller body than the populace, naturally develops its own corporate will. And Rousseau predicted this corporate will, the self-interest of the ruling class, would inevitably usurp the sovereign. It would substitute its own narrow interest for the people's general will.
And when that happens, the contract is broken.
The contract is broken, the state dissolves, and it collapses into anarchy, or, more often, oligarchy.
Let's test this theoretical fracture point using a contemporary case study. The controversy around hydraulic fracturing or fracking seems like a perfect modern manifestation of this conflict between the selfish, private will and the collective common good.
Fracking provides a really stark example of how the individual will, which is driven by corporate profit and private mineral rights, comes into direct conflict with the common good, which is the community's safety and health.
So while proponents frame it as an economic public good, providing domestic fuel and jobs,
Rousseau's principles would highlight that it's antithetical to human flourishing and security.
Lay out the points of conflict for us. Why is aggressive resource development a fracture point for the common good?
Well, the conflicts are legion. First, there's resource demand. The industry uses up to 100 billion gallons of fresh water annually. That's a massive demand on a shared finite resource required for amour de soi, for basic self-preservation.
And then there are the contamination risks.
Huge risks. The disposal of radioactive wastewater, air contamination from methane and carcinogens. Epidemiological studies have linked these to declining public health and increased birth defects in surrounding communities. And then there's the social destabilization.
The boom and bust cycle.
Exactly. These boom towns experience temporary surges of wealth, sure, but it's coupled with skyrocketing rents that displace locals, increased crime, stress on public infrastructure, strained social services. And when the bust inevitably arrives, the industry leaves behind thousands of defunct, uncapped wells and a decimated social structure.
So these activities prioritize immediate material accumulation, the drive of amor proprio over the long-term safety, well-being, and social stability of the community.
That's the conflict in a nutshell.
So in this scenario, how did the citizens, the sovereign, attempt to exercise the general will?
Well, in states rich in shale gas like Colorado and Pennsylvania, multiple local jurisdictions attempted to use their legislative power. Cities like Longmont, Lafayette, and Fort Collins exercised popular sovereignty. They organized ballot initiatives, a form of direct democracy, to ban fracking within their city limits.
Fort Collins, I think, passed its ban with a 56% majority.
It did. And these were legitimate, direct expressions of the general will concerning the health and environmental safety, the common good of their specific populations.
But the state government, the magistrates, intervened, and they fractured the contract by denying that local general will.
They did, systematically. The sovereign, the local populace, was overridden by the government, meaning the state legislature and regulatory bodies. They used state preemption laws. A legal precedent like the 1992 Voss v. Lunfall-Bros. Inc. decision in Colorado or Pennsylvania's Act 13 asserts that the state has the sole authority over oil and gas regulation.
Which effectively nullifies any local attempts at self-governance.
It does. So the legal mechanism of state preemption ensured that the individual will of these powerful business organizations trumped the general will of the collective community.
This is the clearest example of Rousseau's worst-case scenario. The triumph of the individual will, driven by the greed of the gas industry and economic factions, over the common good.
It is. The state prioritized aggressive resource development and the protection of private property and mineral rights for a select few. And Rousseau was very explicit about this. Individual rights over property are always subordinate to the community's right to all, which is required for the social fabric's solidity. By placing corporate and individual mineral rights above the community's health and safety, the contract lost its legitimacy.
And the ultimate result of this political failure is the degradation of democracy itself. It spirals into the very oligarchy that Rousseau warned about.
The state inevitably devolves when the corporate will of a small, wealthy faction is prioritized. And, contemporary research really bears this out. There was a significant study of U.S. policy spanning 2 decades that suggested the preferences of the majority often have very little measurable influence on policy outcomes.
Whereas policymaking is dominated by powerful business organizations and a small number of affluent Americans.
That is the literal definition of oligarchy, a government run by the wealthy few, substituting their corporate interest for the public interest.
Rousseau warned aristocracy degenerates into oligarchy.
He did. And in his final bleak assessment of a dissolving state, he says the general will becomes mute, unable to speak for the populace, and the meanest interest brazenly appropriates the sacred name of the public good.
When the ruling elite use the language of freedom and economic benefit to justify policies that ultimately enslave and harm the majority,
then the social contract is definitively fractured, and the state loses all legitimacy. The citizens who fail to fulfill the duties of a subject, the duty to participate and ratify the law while enjoying the rights of a citizen, ultimately lead to the ruin of the body politic.
But despite this, this overwhelming cycle of political fracture, we do see glimmers of Rousseau's concept of renaturalization. We see the enforcement of the common good being integrated into some modern governance structures, which suggests humanity hasn't completely succumbed to the chains.
And this renewal is a critical counterpoint to all that political pessimism. It reflects a conscious attempt to enforce the general will by recognizing that the common good has to extend beyond just human material interests.
One of the most radical examples was in Ecuador in 2008.
Exactly. They instated the rights of nature, or Pachamama, directly into their constitution. This constitutional amendment grants ecosystems the right to exist, to persist, and to regenerate. It effectively recognizes nature itself as part of the body politic.
And it asserts that nature's well-being is intrinsically tied to the common good of the human community.
Yes, and we see that same principle of renaturalization taking hold locally in the U.S., often as an explicit response to the political fracture caused by those preemption laws.
In the community rights movement.
Precisely. It draws heavily on this idea of asserting the local general will against corporate usurpation. In Pittsburgh in 2010, the city passed a Bill of Rights banning fracking. And this landmark legislation explicitly recognized that natural community streams, aquifers, wetlands possess inalienable rights.
And it stated that protecting residents and the environment constitutes the highest and best use of police powers.
They were asserting that the local community's amour de soi outweighed the corporate amour propre of the gas industry.
And this was mirrored in Santa Monica in 2013.
It was. They adopted a sustainability bill of rights, and they explicitly argued that corporate rights cannot take precedence over the fundamental environmental rights of human and natural communities. These acts represent the general will struggling to enforce the common good over the private appetites and the destructive distinction-seeking of amour propre.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau's philosophical challenge persists centuries later. How does humanity, born free, live everywhere but in chains? He forces us to realize that the chains are not necessarily imposed by some external dictator, but by our own manufactured dependence.
A dependence driven by that relentless desire for distinction and external validation, the demands of amour propre.
And his legacy offers us these two interwoven pathways toward genuine freedom and psychological authenticity. And they both serve as really profound correctives to his own personal failures.
They do. He intellectualized virtue to such a degree that he failed the most basic natural duty of a father. Yet his system for society insists on the primacy of duty. His roadmap demands two things. First, nurturing the individual conscience through proper education and renaturalization, building a strong amour de soi grounded in reality.
And second, the construction of a political system guided by the general will that enforces the common good, the flourishing of all life over the corrupting, selfish, private appetites that inevitably lead to societal collapse and personal enslavement.
The decision to balance our basic instinct for self-preservation with a virtuous, reality-rooted social recognition transforming vanity into pride that remains the perennial struggle for the modern citizen.
That brings us to the end of this deep dive.